Hi everyone, my name is Lee Pucker. I'm the CEO of the Wireless Innovation Forum, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on lower 3 gigahertz, next frontier in spectrum sharing between federal systems and commercial telecom. Before we get started, a couple of administrative notes. First, the slides presented during this webinar are going to be posted at wirelessinnovation.org/webinars. All the slides from all of our webinars are located there, and these will be posted along with the video recording later today. The recorded webinar will be available on the forum's YouTube channel, so if you subscribe to that channel, you should be able to see it again later today. And if you need any information on any of this at all, please feel free to contact me at lee.pucker@wirelessinnovation.org, and I'm happy to help you out. If you have questions today, there's a questions window in your client screen. Please type the question into there, and then I will be moderating the questions and passing them to our panelists to respond to at appropriate times. With that, let me introduce our panelists. So today we have Andy Clegg. He's with Google, and he's the Wireless Innovation Forum's Chief Technical Officer and the co-chair of the WIN Forum's Highly Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Work Group. In addition, we have Amit Mukhopadhyay from Nokia, also co-chair of the WIN Forum Highly Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Group and a member of the WIN Forum Board of Directors. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andy. Andy, you can take it away from here.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So we've divided the webinar up into kind of 5 broad topic areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about the current landscape in the 3 gigahertz band, not just the lower part, but all of it, give you a sense of the evolution of the band. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we're doing dynamic spectrum sharing in CBRS and also in the AMBIT band, which I'll explain what those bands are in a minute, because that's a bit of a precursor to how things may pan out in the lower 3 gigahertz, where that's still to be determined. And then I'll hand it over to Amit. He's going to talk about why we need sort of more dynamic temporal and spatial sharing between DoD and commercial systems because of the nature of the lower 3 gigahertz. And he'll talk a little bit about some of the enhancements to the way we're sharing now that could help support a lot more dynamic environment in the lower 3 gigahertz band. And then finally, Lee and Amit and I will talk a bit about what WIN Forum is doing right now as our contribution to improving dynamic spectrum sharing for applicability to the lower 3 gigahertz band. So next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so every talk about spectrum has to start with how spectrum is a vital resource, and it's it's in high demand, and there's not enough of it to go around. But specifically with regard to the 3 gigahertz band, it's believed that the American leadership in next G technologies is going to require more spectrum access and better technology, both for the private sector, but also for the public sector. What can we do to the incumbent systems to make them more amenable to sharing with 5G, 6G, whatever. And it's important for nation's economic growth, but I also don't want to underemphasize the need to protect the DoD. It has critical operations in the 3 gigahertz band that need to be protected. They're there to keep us all safe, and we need to make sure that they're fully protected as well. So, we're all in this together. We're all in the common goal, and we just need to find a way to increase spectrum access for next G technologies while also protecting the types of operations that the DoD and other federal government agencies need to maintain in that band. So that's the ultimate goal. Next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so being a good Googler, I decided to see what Google Gemini could generate when I asked it to explain low, mid, and high band spectrum because I was too lazy to type it out myself. And it actually did a pretty good job. You can sort of divide the spectrum into what's been called more or less arbitrarily low, mid, and high band. So the low band are generally the lower frequencies, and for cellular technology and broadband and other things, it's kind of 600 megahertz to a gigahertz, or a little higher, maybe 2 gigahertz, typically called low band. And the advantages of low band is that it's able to go farther distances, penetrate buildings a little bit better. But the downside is there's less total spectrum available there. So you can't get as much bandwidth, and bandwidth translates into the speed of your connection in terms of bit rate. So, it's a bit of a trade-off. And then skipping midband, if you go to high band, so these are the much higher frequencies, 24 gigahertz and above, whatever, you have a lot more bandwidth there. So you can, in theory, get a lot more throughput, a lot better bit rate. But the propagation isn't so good. Obstacles, signals don't diffract around obstacles as well, and obstacles become more absorbing, and trying to get signals from outside to get inside becomes very problematic. And so, you have the bandwidth, but you don't really have the key propagation. So people have started to claim that mid-band is sort of the sweet spot. You get a decent propagation, decent coverage, potential building penetration, and at the same time you have a fair amount of bandwidth. So people, and again, arbitrary or not, a lot of people have sort of considered mid-band to be the sweet spot, and 3 gigahertz is sort of that prime mid-band spectrum. So that's why 3 gigahertz spectrum is important at all to us, and has become topic of great discussion among the spectrum policy crowd. But if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is in the US, the 3 gigahertz band is a bit of a complicated thing. We have a relatively unique circumstance in the US where the 3 gigahertz band has been highly used by the DoD. A lot of their, and federal systems, there are many radar systems that are used on ships, on planes, on ground-based things, for a number of things, air traffic control, for fire control, for tracking. There's also non-radar type things, station keeping equipment that allows planes to fly in tight formation and things. There's a lot of systems that the DoD has deployed at 3 gigahertz. And so trying to deploy mobile broadband in 3 gigahertz is a bit more of a challenge in the United States than it is in other countries. So specifically, I like to kind of divide the 3 gigahertz band up into chunks that you can kind of get your brain around. So from 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz, the DoD and other federal systems, there are a lot of them. There are dozens of different systems, not dozens of transmitters, but dozens of systems, each of which have many transmitters and receivers that need to be protected. So I consider the 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz band to be highly occupied by DoD and federal systems. On the other hand, DoD and other federal systems also use the 3.5 to 3.65 gigahertz band, but the intensity of use, the variety of systems there is a bit less. So I've kind of colored it and segmented it off a little bit differently. And then traditionally, and this applies to what the band looked like before 2019, there was a 50 megahertz segment from 3.65 to 3.7 that was used under Part 90 of the FCC rules for wireless internet service providers to provide home internet, typically in rural areas, from towers to individual homes and things like that. And then finally, the upper part of the band, 3.7 to 4.2, had traditionally been used only for fixed satellite service, receive only earth stations. So they're not transmitting, they're just receiving in that band. But these systems are highly sensitive to interference and had to be protected. So this is what was happening prior to 2019, but towards the end of 2019, and then after that period, there was a transition in the 3 gigahertz band in which we were able to use it more intensively for mobile broadband systems. So Lee, if you flip to the next chart here, you'll see what the band is now. And again, this started evolving after 2019. This wasn't all in 2019, but it started evolving in 2019 to what we have today. So what we have today is the DoD is still using the band. So you see the blue part and the green part where the DoD has, intensive use and still, considerable use, but not quite as intense in the green area. But you now have parts of the 3 gigahertz band used for mobile broadband systems. So if I go in time order, The yellow part is where the CBRS, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service band, is now. So 3.55 to 3.65 is where PAL, the priority access licensees, and the general authorized access licensees operate. And then the 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz portion is where the general authorized access systems only are allowed to operate. And so what happened was the WISPs that you see there in the top part, they were the Part 90 rules that they operated under. They were sunset, and most of them got assimilated into the CBRS. A lot of them now are operating as general authorized access tier, but the Part 90 WISP band doesn't exist as it did prior to 2019. It's been, for the most part, assimilated into CBRS. And then another thing that happened is that the fixed satellite service, in a bit of an incentive type auction, they were able to repack a lot of their earth stations into the upper 200 megahertz of the band, and then leave the lower 300 megahertz of that band to be used for mobile broadband, although there's a 20 megahertz sliver there that's a guard band between the two. And so that became the 3.7 gigahertz service, which people typically call C-band. That's only in the contiguous US because Hawaii, Alaska, other places still rely more on fixed satellite service, but it's an intensively used, it's a very high power macrocellular type of thing, much higher power than CBRS, but that's what was cleared, and the auction revenue went to help pay to move the fixed satellite service out of that band and put them up in the upper 200 megahertz. And then finally, the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band, which is called the 3.45 gigahertz service, that's its official name, came to be under the first Trump administration. That was worked out through America's midband initiative team, which was a presidential type committee that figured out how they could share mobile broadband with the DoD systems that were operating in the band. And so that was quickly decided and then auctioned off. And 3.45 gigahertz service has rules very similar to the 3.7 gigahertz service, very high power compared to CBRS. So you have like two high power bands on either side of CBRS. So, you know, this is the evolution. This is in practice what has happened to the midband spectrum basically in the last 5 or 6 years. If you go to the next slide, please, Lee. So now what we are talking about when we call midband spectrum or lower 3 gig. Oh, and apologies, I need to explain another aspect of this. 3GPP, which is the global body that designates bands for example, LTE or 5G NR use, they have defined a whole number of bands around the spectrum, but in particular for this band, they have 3 designated bands for LTE and 5G NR. They have band N77, which covers 3.3 up to 4.2 gigahertz. And that's the band effectively under which the 3.7 gigahertz and the 3.45 gigahertz service systems operate. There's also globally a 3GPP band N78, which goes from also 3.3 at the lower end to 3.8 at the upper end. And then finally, you know, before either of those two bands were defined, there's 3GPP band N48, which is essentially the CBRS band, which has rules specific to CBRS. So you know, there's these global 3GPP bands that have been defined, and other than the CBRS band N48 that was specifically tailored for CBRS, the other ones, you know, they don't. If you're playing Tetris, they don't quite fit into the band plan for the 3 gigahertz band, but they at least allow the 3.45 and 3.7 gigahertz band services to operate. Next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so specifically, what are we talking about today? When we say lower 3 gigahertz, this part outlined in the red box, that's what we're talking about, lower 3 gigahertz. The interest now is, now that we've, you know, rejiggered the fixed satellite service band up at the top to fit in 3.7, we've defined the CBRS band in 3.55 to 3.7, and the AMBIT band is now operating in 3.45 to 3.55. Can we find even more spectrum by finding ways to share between commercial systems and DoD or federal systems in this very lower part of the 3 gigahertz band, so specifically 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz. That's what's commonly referred to as lower 3 gigahertz, and that specifically is what we're talking about here in the webinar. Next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so I'm not going to go through every one of these. I put these two slides, this one and the next one, in here mostly so that for those of you who download the slides, you have links to all of the primary documents that trace the history of how we got to where we are today in the 3 gigahertz band. And really, if you go back in the historical context, it really goes back to 2010, so 15 years ago when the FCC issued the National Broadband Plan. And then most of what has happened since then has sort of been follow-ons to that or congressional action that have responded to interests that were created in these various plans that have gone on over the intervening 15 years. But I've got links in there if you want to look at any of these specifically. But let me just jump down to the bottom of this slide, and that's the 2021 November date. So after, just above that, the 3.45 gigahertz service band was auctioned, and then later that year, the Infrastructure Initiative and Job Investments and Job Act, the IIJA, was the first to provide funds for the DoD to start studying, what can we do in 3.1 to 3.45, the lower 3 gigahertz band. And as a result of that, the National Spectrum Consortium back around that time stood up this committee called the Partnership for Advanced Trusted and Holistic Spectrum Solutions, or PAS, which basically brought together DoD, industry, academia, everyone who could put their minds together to look at how we could potentially share the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band. Like, if we could share it, and if we could, how would we share it? And after a couple of years, the first report from that first PAS process, it was called the Emerging Midband Spectrum Sharing Feasibility Assessment, which is commonly referred to as EMBRAS, concluded that sharing the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz service between the federal government DoD use and commercial use is feasible, but under certain conditions, which I'll get to in a minute. So that was an interesting development. If you go to the next slide, Lee, after that point, so in more than a year ago, NTIA released the National Spectrum Strategy, and it specifically called out the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band for in-depth study. Now, this was in addition to what was being done in the PAS process. It led to a little bit of confusion about what's the difference between this study and the PAS study. I'll leave that to others to opine on, but there are, in a way, kind of parallel processes going on. And the NTIA issued an implementation plan in March of 2024 that explained, how we were going to get to where we want to go in the National Spectrum Strategy. And in there was a specific schedule and milestones for the lower 3 gigahertz band. So first they would, the individual federal agencies under the Spectrum Relocation Fund would have to submit plans for how much it would cost for them to accommodate shared spectrum use in the 3.1 to 3.45, which may involve relocating systems or tweaking systems, whatever. That process was completed just last month. And then the other plan was to establish an intragovernmental and government industry study and exchange groups to discuss the band sharing issues. And that's what's done right now under the National Spectrum Consortium, what they call the multi-stakeholder group. One of the key items coming out of this was the plan to develop a dynamic spectrum sharing demonstration project, a very aggressive schedule of having that done by 2025 September. So really not much time to get that done. And then they would coordinate the findings from that demonstration with all of the stakeholders by July of 2026, and they would issue a final report by October of 2026. So this is kind of the schedule, a very tight timeline we're operating under. In 2024 April, just if you're not following along closely enough, PAS was rebooted, commonly referred to, or at least referred to by me, as PAS 2. And that essentially was the starting point where those 9 conditions under which the band could be shared. Let's take a closer look and let's see if we can make it work. And then just last month, the National Spectrum Consortium issued a request for prototype proposal that would be funded by DoD to actually do this advanced dynamic spectrum sharing demonstration, which would be, I guess, nominally the September 2025 DSS demo. So everybody right now is trying to scramble to get proposals together. The proposals are due next month. So a lot of activity here. But this is all focused on identifying how, well, if, first of all, and how commercial systems and the DoD could share the lower 3 gigahertz band, 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz. So next slide, please, Lee. So what were the conditions that the first PAS report, the EMBRIS report, came up with? I'm zeroing in on the middle of this plot. And these were sort of the conditions under which DoD thought the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band, or the PAS process, thought it could be shared. Number one, DoD has to retain regulatory primacy. So they have to be the primary incumbents in the band that have to be protected. Seems reasonable. They have to maintain a national emergency preemption policy that if there's a national emergency, they're able to turn off whatever is sharing the band. That's true in the CBRS band right now anyway. And I believe it's true in the 3.45 gigahertz band. Honestly, I can't remember, but it's true in the CBRS band. There's a national emergency preemption policy. Then what they said was, based upon how we're doing CBRS sharing, which is working for CBRS, it would have to be expanded and approved upon to accommodate all of the different DoD systems that operate in the 3.1 to 3.45. In the CBRS band, we really, when it comes down to it, there's really one principal system, DoD system, we're coexisting with, and some ground-based systems and things here and there, but there really is one principal system we're coexisting with. In the lower 3 gigahertz, a much greater number of systems that we'd have to coexist with. Then they say the government cannot be liable for damage to commercial systems. What they're worried about is these high-powered radars operating in the band might destroy handsets or base stations if they're too close. This was a concern in the CBRS band as well. It turned out, there's nothing to it. Nothing has ever been damaged by any government radar in the CBRS band, even though we have CBRS even operating on Navy bases and other military bases. Nothing has ever been damaged by a government system. I think the concern is overblown, my personal opinion. We would have to address the operational security issues, make sure the DoD is protected, obfuscated, secure, things like that, however we share the band. And, that's true in some of the things we're doing in CBRS. The defense industrial base would have to retain band access for testing and experimentation. This is an interesting issue because, there are defense contractors, and again, I'm opinionating here. It's my own thoughts, not those of Winforum or anybody else. But these are often operated under non-federal government GMF entries. So they're basically commercial entities that are doing experimentation on behalf of DoD. And technically, in my opinion, these are experimental operations that don't really aren't granted protections above, say, CBRS or certainly not above the incumbent DoD systems. They think otherwise. They think they're full-blown DoD systems, and they deserve the protections thereof. I'm sure somebody will put a nasty comment in the thing here, but anyway, they want to make sure that this defense industrial base, these non-governmental contractors that are experimenting in the band, still retain band access for their testing and experimentation. I think it's perfectly fine. I think we can coexist with them and everything. I think it's more of a policy argument over beer kind of thing. But I don't think that's a big issue. That we'd also be able to accommodate current and future federal systems. So we would design to share not just with what's operating in the band now, but anything that might come in the future. That's a challenge, but certainly something that the DoD deserves, and their future systems should be protected. We have to establish interference safeguards. I think that's a given, and address resource requirements. And I think what they mean here is, even though the DoD would be primary and the secondary users, the people who would share, have to protect the DoD, what we're learning in CBRS is that doesn't necessarily mean the DoD doesn't have to lift a finger. they might have to tweak their operational concepts slightly in order to accommodate sharing. They are primary, they still get protected, but there are impacts on DoD operations when they have to share the band with somebody else. And I think they need funding for those, for the resources required to basically accommodate the sharing, which is also entirely reasonable in my opinion. Next slide, please, Lee.
Sure, and Andy, when you get a second, we have a question on a previous slide.
Okay, sure, let's go for it.
So let me back up to that slide, which was here. And the question was, is any country other than the US looking at these other bands for high-powered operation, high-powered commercial operation, or is this kind of a US only problem?
Already in other parts of the world, N77 and N78 are being used for high power operation. So other countries around the world, and in fact, CTIA has a nice chart showing where N77 and N78 are being used around the world. So yes, other countries are using it. Other countries, militaries don't have quite the intensive use of the 3 gigahertz band that we do. That's what's making it more challenging. There is this question, that obvious question that comes to mind, that our DoD doesn't only operate in the US, and in fact, in general, most of its critical operations are going to be happening overseas in Asia, Mediterranean, other types of places. So how is it that they're able to operate in these areas when these other areas already have high power operations in these bands? It's a legitimate question to which first of all, I'm not responsible for providing an answer, and I won't provide an answer because I don't know. But it's a legitimate question. But at the same time, I think we have to set that aside. There's training that has to go on in the US and things like that. I think we just have to recognize that DoD wants to be protected the best it can wherever it is. And so we kind of have to set those questions aside and kind of continue on and discuss how here in the US we could make use of those bands without interfering with the DoD's objectives. They have a legitimate need to use these bands and to protect all of us. So, I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
Yep.
And now I will go down to your next slide.
Okay, and so because the NBRS study concluded, we need to improve and expand upon how CBRS does things. Let me say a few words about how CBRS does things to give you an idea of, the starting point in a way. So first slide, please, here, Lee. So the CBRS band has two principal, what we call tier 1 incumbents. And again, that's the federal DoD radars. There's also some non-federal fixed satellite service receive-only earth stations, that legacy systems that operate in the CBRS band. I'm not going to talk about those. Those are easy to protect. They're static. They're not, not really the topic here. The DoD radars, on the other hand, are protected on a dynamic basis because the in-band radars come and go. So they're, the principal in-band radar is a shipborne radar that operates off the coast. And those radars aren't on all of the time, and we only need to protect them when they are on. There are kind of three flavors or varieties of radars we have to protect. So it's the shipborne Navy radars. That's kind of the principal one. There are a few ground-based, like a dozen or so ground-based sites around the country where DoD entities and contractors have radar systems for training and testing and R&D. We have to protect those. We have one site, China Lake out in California, where DoD does some airborne operations. We need to protect them. So we're doing that. If you want all of the gory details of all of the different encumbrances in the CBRS band, there is this WinForm technical report 5003, which we created just before the CBRS auction, that explains in god-awful detail all of the different systems that have to be protected from CBRS. All of the details are in there. If you need, if you have insomnia or whatever and you want to check it out, it's all there. Next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so how do we dynamically protect incumbent DoD radars and CBRS? Because some of these concepts may translate over to lower 3, and this is what Amit is going to talk about in the next section coming up shortly. The government has basically broken up the coastline, like in the contiguous U.S. There's roughly 50 blocks of areas around the contiguous coastline, each of those called a dynamic protection area. They're roughly 100 or 200 by 100 or 200 kilometers in size. And those are areas where the DoD may be operating its shipborne radar. And the night before each day, the spectrum access systems, which manage the CBRS devices, operate in the CBRS band, have pre-calculated on a channel-by-channel basis that if a radar becomes active on a particular frequency in a particular DPA, dynamic protection area, which CBRS devices have to be reconfigured, either turned off or moved to a different channel or whatever, to avoid interference of that radar. I won't go into the detail, but suffice it to say these calculations are very complex, involve lots of propagation loss calculations to lots of points at lots of different frequencies, and these calculations take 2 or 3 hours every night. It's a long calculation. So if we detect radar activity in a particular DPA on a particular CBRS channel during the day, we already know which CBSDs need to be modified or moved or powered down, and we notify those CBSDs. That's the magic of how this is done dynamically. So the rule is that once the spectrum access system becomes aware of radar activity in a particular DPA, the impacted CBSDs, which is what we call CBRS devices, have to be reconfigured within 5 minutes. So that's kind of the dynamic nature we're dealing with now. And I can tell you, without spoiling Amit's thunder here, 5 minutes isn't going to cut it for the lower 3 gigahertz band because there's a lot more dynamic stuff going on, airborne and all sorts of stuff. But that's what we do in CBRS. Next slide, please, Lee. So just an example of a DPA. This is the DPA East 1, we call it. It's off the coast of Norfolk. It protects a lot of the ships that come and go from the Norfolk Naval Station, which is the largest Navy base in the world, has the greatest concentration of the types of ships that have the primary radar that we're protecting in CBRS. San Diego and Bremerton, Washington are 2 other high activity areas. But this gives you an idea of the size of the DPA. It goes from halfway up the eastern shore to halfway down the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And then the neighborhood, the area where, for example, in this case, for the higher power outdoor category B CBRS devices, the neighborhood where we have to consider any of them as potential interferers is outlined in the blue line there. That's the DPA neighborhood. So that's the concept of a DPA. The DPA is where the DoD may be operating. The DPA neighborhood defines the area around that DPA where we have to consider each CBSD as a potential interferer, and it has to be part of the calculation that we do every night. Next slide, please, Lee. So how does the SAS become aware of DoD radar activity? There's 2 principal ways. There is what we call ESC, Environmental Sensing Capability, and that's a network of essentially glorified radar detectors. For those of you who like to speed when you drive, you probably remember those before the cops moved to LiDAR and lasers, but it's essentially just detecting the radar activities. And when the sensors detect radar activity, there's a little bit of logic applied to determine whether what it's hearing is real and needs to be alerted to the SAS. But if it is, it tells the SAS what CBRS channel the activity is on and what dynamic protection area it's in. Then there's another way called a portal, which is basically, when it comes down to it, a web page that allows the DoD to notify the spectrum access systems, hey, we plan to use this particular dynamic protection area on this particular channel at this particular time. It's almost like a calendar system like thing. The DoD and NTIA run and manage this thing. The spectrum access systems have whitelisted access to this particular page, and they can download every few minutes, what the latest schedule is, and make sure that we protect the DPA accordingly. There's also some always-on ground-based DPAs. So these are sites where they may operate below 3550, so outside of the CBRS band, but they have to be protected from out-of-band CBRS interference anyway. Because our sensors don't, work below 3550, those dynamic protections are always on. Not a big deal because their neighborhoods are very small, like 2 kilometers. So it's not, we don't have a lot of CBSDs in those that are impacted by those always on ground-based DPAs. And then finally, there are 4 areas the DoD has defined that are exclusion zones, where in particular frequency ranges we're never allowed to operate. And I'll show maps here in a minute. So next slide, please, Lee.
Hey, Andy, a question from the audience. Can you comment briefly on what the propagation models are that are used for calculating the DPAs?
Yep, I got a slide on that. It'll bore you to death, but I do have a slide on that. So next slide, Lee, please. That'll get us a slide closer to the propagation slide. This is just a summary table for easier reference of the 4 different dynamic protection areas that we protect. Again, they're the ESC monitored DPAs, which we call EDPAs. There's the portal monitored DPAs, which we call PDPAs. There's the always on ground-based DPAs we call GB DPAs, and there's the exclusion zone, the EXEs. And these are not secrets. You can go to that URL listed on the slide there, and you can download KML files for all of these DPAs, and it includes the metadata like their DPA neighborhood size and all that other kind of stuff. So if you're interested in seeing where these DPAs are, you can go to that URL and download the files. Next slide, please, Lee. So just kind of a plot, this is a contiguous US with the DPAs. So the red areas are the dynamic protection areas defined by DoD and NTIA, and the green areas represent the neighborhoods where we have to consider CBSDs as potential interferers. And again, let me emphasize, if your CBSD is in the neighborhood, it doesn't mean you will be impacted by activity in the DPA. It just means that your CBSD has to be included in the calculation of aggregate interference into the DPA. If you're very close to the coast and you're running high power and your antenna is pointing towards the water, yeah, you'll probably be impacted. If you're on the far end of the DPA and you're running lower power, or you're low or in a valley, or your DPA is pointed away from the ocean, you probably won't be impacted, and everything in between. So just because your CBSD is in a DPA doesn't mean that you'll necessarily be impacted. If you're outside of any DPA neighborhoods, you will not be impacted. So most of the country, geographically speaking, is outside of any DPA neighborhoods, and you do not get impacted by DoD activity. But since the population of the U.S. tends to fall along the coast, population-wise, a significant fraction of people end up being in DPA neighborhoods. Next slide, please, Lee.
Yeah, we've got a couple more questions if you want me to hold them, or
let me move on, just because I want to make sure we leave Amit enough time, but we will get to the questions. Just some plots. These are the portal DPAs and their neighborhoods. So like I said, there's about a dozen around the country. There's also one in Hawaii that we're operating as portal, but these are relatively small neighborhoods and sites, except of course the New Mexico White Sands and things like that. But anyway, these are the portal managed DPAs. Next slide, please, Lee. These are the ground-based DPAs. So these are the R&D sites where adjacent band, very small neighborhoods, very small areas. Not really a big factor here, but just thought I'd put them here to scale so you can see that they're not really all impactful. And then the next slide shows the exclusion zones. There are particular frequency ranges and areas. So in those 3 areas towards the east of the U.S., we can never operate CBRS in 3650 to 3700 in those areas. It's just pure exclusion zone. And then out there in Nevada, in the PAL portion of the band, 3550 to 3650, we cannot authorize any operations there. But again, that's fairly remote, so it's not a big deal. The next slide, please, Lee. This is the China Lake dynamic protection area and the neighborhoods for it. So the red is the airborne area where China Lake may be doing airborne operations, and the outer blue line is the neighborhood size around that DPA. The DoD has done a great job of trying to shrink these things to the minimal possible impact zone. And here, most of it's in the desert, so it's not highly impactful. Next slide, please, Lee. The ESC operation, we're not required to detect any activity. There are 5 defined DoD radar waveforms that the ESCs have to be designed to detect. They can ignore everything else, but they do have to detect these waveforms. They were defined by DoD and NTIA, and our ESCs were tested in the lab at NTIA ITS accordingly. There is this NTIA technical memorandum 18-527, which has all these details in it as to what we have to detect and how. So you can certainly refer to that if you're interested, but these are the only radar waveforms we need to detect. And the point being here in the CBRS band, we have a very finite set of waveforms we have to detect. In the lower 3 gigahertz, it's a much bigger variety of systems. I think ESC is going to be a bigger lift if we have to do that in the lower 3 gigahertz band significantly. Next slide, please, Lee. Challenges with ESC is, number one, they have to themselves be protected from interference due to CBRS operating on the same frequencies. And so, the map shows that if you plop down an ESC sensor in the Virginia Beach area, this is sort of the area where you would not be able to put up any CBSDs because their interference into the ESC sensor would exceed the ESC sensor's protection criteria. We call these whisper zones. And so, it's kind of a downside of ESC that it impacts the very band that it's trying to help. So, we try to minimize impacts, but, again, as you can see from this is fictitious, but you can see from the scale here, our sensors can have significant impacts on the ability to do CBRS. And, not to also mention that, ESCs can get false detection sometimes from interference. So that's another downside of ESC. ESC is really not a great idea, but again, there are people who favor it over portal type activations for good reason. So, when we look at lower 3 gigahertz, we're going to have to balance these requirements and the ability to design an ESC that can sense, dozens of different systems. Next slide, please, Lee. We can go, I've already mentioned some of these, so we can go next. I want to make sure I leave Amit enough time. Somebody asked about the propagation model. So, so the propagation model has evolved. Originally, it was mostly based on ITM by itself, which is an extremely conservative model. It takes terrain into account, but it doesn't take clutter, the impact of buildings and trees and things like that on losses. So recently, you may have read about, the CBRS 2.0 developments and shrinking the DPA neighborhoods greatly and things like that. That was a result of deciding to, we would now add the P2108, the ITU P2108 clutter loss model to ITM for devices that are at or below 6 meters, which is the majority of CBRS devices. So this greatly reduced the size of the DPA neighborhoods and the number of CBSDs that had to be considered for interference into the DPAs. So this has greatly reduced the impact. If you look at it globally or nationally, we have reduced the number of devices that are impacted by DoD activity, all told, by 85% because of the addition of clutter into the propagation model. So a big reduction in the number of devices. In certain areas, the reduction is even bigger, 95% or so. But globally, overall, a reduction of about 85% in the number of devices that are potentially impacted by DoD activity. Okay, so next slide, I just have a short section in here on the 3.45 gigahertz band and how that protects the DoD. So just to remind you that sort of straddles the two kind of DoD operation bands. Down there to the lower part is the heavily occupied. The upper part is the somewhat less heavily occupied. So if you go to the next slide, please, Lee. The way the 3.45 gigahertz service protects the DoD is different from CBRS. There's no sort of central spectrum access system, so to speak, that operates. Instead, they've defined what are called cooperative planning areas and periodic use areas. The cooperative planning areas are geographic areas where before a 3.45 gigahertz licensee puts up a base station, they need to coordinate with the DoD to make sure their base stations won't interfere with any DoD activities in the band. So it's more of a one-on-one pre-coordination that's done. The periodic use areas, all of those are coincident with a cooperative planning area. And those are areas where the DoD, in addition to the cooperative planning area, may occasionally have more intense use. So a little bit of dynamic coordination that has to go on. And so the licensees have to more dynamically coordinate with the DoD. And that process actually, even though the 3.45 gigahertz service has been deployed and things, that whole process of how those coordinations go is still being worked out today. So, all I can say is it's not a centrally spectrum access system like managed system. There's no ESC sensor at the moment that detects radar activity, things like that. This is all sort of prior coordinated directly between the licensees and the DoD. The next slide is I have a little map of where these CPA and PUA areas are. They're not small, it's not an insignificant portion of the country that is in a CPA and or PUA, and they're highly populated areas. If you look up, the mid-Atlantic there's a lot of stuff going on there. So, it's a challenge and it's still being worked out. I'm not a 3.45 gigahertz service licensee, so I can't give you a lot of inside scoop on, how things are going. But, my understanding is, it's going along, but, the process is still being worked out, and it's been a couple of years since the auction. So, we're still shaking out. But, if you're outside any of these CPAs or PUAs and you're a 3.45 gigahertz service licensee, there's no restriction on your deployments and operation. It's only if you're inside these CPAs or PUAs where you've got to work through this coordination process. So I think that's it for my part, Lee. I just wanted to give you a flavor of how we're sharing spectrum in CBRS and 3.45 gigahertz, and a flavor for what the issue is with developing 3.1 to 3.45. Amit's going to give you a lot more detail on how do we move towards coordinating in a much more dynamic environment like the lower 3 gigahertz. So over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Andy. I think for those who've submitted questions, we're going to hold them for now, and then if we have time at the end, we might come back to them. So go ahead, Amit.
Thanks. Lee, if you can give me the pointer, that'd be great. Lee, if you can pass me the pointer. Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was double muted. You should have the pointer now.
Okay. Can you? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So far, Andy gave you a very deep dive into how CBRS and the AMBIT band, the 3.45 gigahertz band, are being shared between commercial systems and federal systems. And he also mentioned how complicated the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band is, and how the question is, how do we enable sharing in this band given all these complicated systems that are incumbent in the spectrum branch? The first thing that comes in mind is basically we have to do sharing. And when you talk about sharing, there are many different aspects: temporal, time-based, spatial, means maintaining some distance, etc. And also there are different terminology floating around. What is sharing? What is dynamic sharing? And so on and so forth. So the first couple of slides, I'll try to make sure that we follow a common terminology so we are all talking the same language. Next slide, please, Lee. Thank you. So, as Andy mentioned, we're talking about the I-Plan, but even before the I-Plan, National Spectrum Strategy was released on November 13, 2023. This was just before the start of WRC 2023. And in this publication, the National Spectrum Strategy identified several bands to be studied for opening up for commercial use. And this 3.1 to 3.45 with the lower 3 gigahertz is one of the chunks of spectrum. And they basically reiterated what came out of the Embers report, the DoD has started the sharing this 350 megahertz of spectrum, and they mentioned that it should be determined to be relocated for shared federal and non-federal use and licensed through auction. DoD determined that sharing is feasible if certain conditions are in place. And it goes on to say additional studies will explore dynamic spectrum sharing and other opportunities for private sector access in the band. Now, the very expression dynamic spectrum sharing, DoD has been using it for some time, but for those of us in the industry that are more familiar with 3GPP, for us, the dynamic spectrum sharing expression means something very different. It is spectrum sharing between 4G LTE and 5G NR that has been in place for several years, right from the beginning introduction of 5G in the US. And there are some operators in the US that actually had to use that feature because there was no specific spectrum available for introduction of 5G. So I just wanted to warn us that it is the dynamic spectrum sharing used here is not necessarily the same dynamic spectrum sharing that is used in 3GPP terminology. Now, going to the next step, the National Spectrum Research and Development Plan that was published in October 2024. Here they have very clearly identified what dynamic spectrum sharing means in this context, right? So in this case, this is very intuitive explanation of what DSS means. It means adaptive coexistence using techniques that enable multiple electromagnetic spectrum users to operate on the same frequencies in the same geographic area. And by using capabilities that can adjust the optimized electromagnetic spectrum usage in real time or near real time, consistent with the defined regulations, policies, and particular spectrum band. Now, on one hand, this clarifies what the DSS means in this context, but also there are other ambiguities it creates, because typically when you talk about coexistence, we do not imply they will operate in the same frequency in the same geographic area in real time. So for the purpose of, again, clarity of our discussions, I will spend a few more minutes trying to clarify what we need to do and how we need to have our thought process clear so that we don't confuse into this terminology. Next slide, please, Lee. Okay, so let's recall quickly what are some of the sharing examples that you know about. And since Andy did such a great job in explaining it, some of these should be fairly straightforward. When you talk about CBRS, right, what happens? The commercial system has to release the spectrum whenever federal incumbent user is active in the same geography. So this is in the temporal sharing, example of temporal or time-based sharing over a predefined geography, which is the DPA neighborhood, right? And the time scale to respond is, say, about 5 minutes, as Andy mentioned. So as soon as the radars become active, the commercial system has to stop functioning using that particular channel within a span of 5 minutes. It is one example of sharing. Then if we think of AMBIT, again, as Andy mentioned before, there are two types: the coordination planning areas, where the incumbent may be active, but we're maintaining separation distances. So to me, this is more an example of coexistence rather than sharing as such. But then there are the periodic usage areas where the manually semi-static sharing is in it. These are places where the radar may be active from time to time, but not all the time. And when the radar is not active, we can still use that particular spectrum. That's the arrangement we have in that part of the spectrum. Then you also have upper 6 gigahertz in the US. And here, I should say the 6 gigahertz of spectrum, now in the whole US 6 gigahertz spectrum. And here, this is authorizing spectrum use by unlicensed spectrum users in higher power outdoor environment, only to make sure it does not cause interference towards licensed 6 GHz fixed service users. The automatic checks are carried out once a day for any adjustment to the unlicensed use. So this is another example of semi-static sharing, because for the 24-hour period, we don't change our operating conditions. We take for granted what is there, we maintain that. There are other examples, but I think for our purposes, these three should suffice for now. And I'm tying this to WRC 27 agenda item 1.7, where we are looking at three bands, 4.4 to 4.8, 7.1 to 5 to 8.4 gigahertz, and then 14.8 to 15.35 gigahertz. And the charter is to consider studies on sharing and compatibility. Now, again, the use of the word sharing is done here, but whether it means the same thing as we understand in dynamic spectrum sharing or not, that is still debatable. We still need to figure out what it means. For US, of course, only 7.1 to 5 is 8.4 is applicable among these agenda items, because these other two are not applicable to the US. But the main concept that you're looking in 3.2 to 3.45 will still speak in the context of spectrum sharing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we go to the actual concepts of sharing, let's look at the main types of radars that are operational in 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz spectrum range. There are three main types: ground-based, maritime, and aeronautical. And within the ground-based radars, there are both fixed or stationary radars as well as mobile radars. The stationary radars are typically for long-range missile and air defense systems. Ground-based mobile radars can be of various types, but this is just an example of a tactical counterfire system, but there could be other types as well, but typically the medium to short range, unlike the fixed radars, which are typically long-range radars. Then we have maritime radars, which are typically long-range air and missile defense systems. And aeronautical radars, we have long-range detection of threats and providing command and control. So this could be the EOAX, this could be the SK, the station-keeping equipment, as Andy mentioned. So all these four main types of radars we need to account for in any spectrum sharing considerations. Now, the fact of the matter is, I just give you 4 examples, but there are several dozens of radar systems, and they're deployed pretty much all over the country, unlike the limited deployment that we have in, say, CBRS band of different types of naval and inland and a few, say, aeronautical radars. This is a very, very complicated system, pretty much all over the country, and many different radars with different operational characteristics. So they will need a different type or many different types of sharing arrangements. It's almost inconceivable that we can have just one solution that might fit overall. We have to look into different options, and that's why we want to tackle this thing with a very, very open mind and not constrain ourselves how we have dealt with the CBRS or AMBIT bands. Let's look at all the possibilities that are there to tackle this problem. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a very, very high-level view to get us a feel of the order of magnitude challenge that we are talking about. Let's review one more time the 3 main types of radar that I mentioned. Fixed radar systems, and these could be active 24/7 or active intermittently. But because these are fixed, they are fully contained within military bases. So no matter what, they're somewhat easier to contain with. You can think of static spatial sharing, or it could be a little bit dynamism could also be there, but it is mostly to deal with interference around the military bases. And if they're active intermittently, there could be an opportunity for temporal sharing as well. So this, we can only be reacting to system activation, and of course when it gets deactivated, the commercial systems can go back to operation. It is important that we quickly regain use of their spectrum, otherwise again the spectrum is not efficiently used. So this is on one hand side perhaps the easiest type of radars to deal with. Then let us move at the terrestrial, mobile, or maritime systems. So these are mobile systems, and even these are mostly contained within the military bases. So they could be moving around within the military bases. They're not stationary, but they're not moving arbitrarily anywhere. They're mostly moving around within the military bases, and some of them could also have arbitrary mobility area. Of course, the naval radars are moving along the coast, but there are the ground-based terrestrial mobile systems could be, on rare occasions, could be moving outside the military bases as well. So the system that we have should be able to take care of them. So again, we could have a static spatial sharing if they're contained within the military bases. But if they're outside, we need to resort to temporal sharing. And because they're mobile, their low response time reacts to mobility. So as soon as we detect the systems are mobile, we need to react and stop using that particular part of the spectrum. So we need to have a fairly low response time, otherwise that will impact the performance of the radars. And the last one, as you can see, the progression of how fast the system needs to react. Airborne radar systems, again, most of the time, they have predefined flight paths, the fixed mobility area, and we can plan the use of the frequency to protect those typical flight paths. That's not a big challenge from, at least from a technical perspective. But however, we have to be prepared for the aeronautical radars, AWACS, to venture into arbitrary mobility areas where maybe in case of national emergencies or some other purposes they may. So the system again has to be ready, prepared to deal with this high-speed mobility of the systems. So when they're within that defined basis or flight path, we can still have a simple statistical sharing. However, when they are moving outside, the temporal sharing has to be initiated with a very low response time because of the high speed of the mobility of this aeronautical system. So you can see the same, whatever system we come up with or group of systems we come up with, the degree of difficulty increases with the different types of radar. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, going back to the discussion on, say, temporal and geographical sharing, we, as again Andy mentioned, we have to be very much cognizant of DoD's needs for this particular spectrum. And so here I'm trying to contrast the needs for or requirement for DoD versus what the commercial needs are. I've listed, say, only 4 of the paths, the recommendations that come, what the conditions that need to be in place so that the spectrum can be shared. And you went through the whole 9 conditions. I'm not going to repeat them. Some of them are very obvious: national emergency preemption, they should be able to preempt, inference, interference safeguards have to be in place, and so on and so forth. But if you look at from the commercial side, right, the particular spectrum, right, this particular spectrum is valuable for us if and only if the four, let's say, dimensions of that spectrum we can have good ownership of. And when I imply by that is, let's say, the geography. We want minimize the production areas of the coordination zones. That means maximize the area in which the commercial systems can operate. So geography is one of the levers. Then think of time. Maximize the time of spectrum availability. So again, we would like to be able to use the spectrum over maximum geography and also most of the time. Power. At least from the commercial mobile network side, we want to have maximum power that is compatible with the macro network infrastructure, again, to minimize building a lot of cells just for coverage purposes. And last but not the least, the frequency. Again, we like to use the entire frequency, 250 megahertz. And if we have less, the import the demand for that spectrum becomes less attractive for commercial use. So in all these four dimensions, the less restrictions we have, the more it is useful for commercial deployment. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, again, in the interest of establishing some terminology and going forward with a common set of understanding, I would like to us to first agree upon or have a common understanding of what we mean by coexistence and sharing. And within the sharing, we will talk about semi-static, dynamic, and highly dynamic. Now, highly dynamic spectrum sharing is an activity we have taken up in Wireless Innovation Forum, and I'm going to distinguish it from the dynamic spectrum sharing that some of us may be associating with CBRS kind of thing. Why do we need this distinction? It should become clearer as we go along this presentation. Now, what do we mean by coexistence? Typically, this is static. That means the operating conditions are static, and incumbents do not change their use of spectrum in temporal, geographical, or frequency dimensions. So the incumbents basically continue to operate however they have been operating, and their service is unencumbered. New entrants, in this case, it would be the commercial operators, will have to operate in a way that does not interfere with incumbents. So all the responsibility lies with the new entrants. New entrant is expected to avoid interference, maintain separation distance, avoid radiating in certain directions, and any other means to avoid interfering with the incumbent operation. Historically, there has been no expectation from the incumbents to improve, transmit, or receive capabilities that may benefit new entrants. This is, again, from historical perspective we are talking about. And this been most of coexistence has been mostly the way a particular spectrum has been used by, say, two or more different entities. But if we talk about sharing, what does it mean in terms of principles? The operating conditions are dynamic in nature. Incumbents and new entrants share the same spectrum in time dimension. That is, at least there's one way to think about it. The dynamicity is measured in the time dimension, or visualized in the time dimension. Incumbents, of course, continue to get protection from new entrants, at least in the short term. New entrants take all the responsibility to avoid interference towards incumbents. Again, it's not much different from coexistence, but again, trying to establish some basic principle that has been in practice for a while. Does not mean it should be continued to be like that, but just to understand what has been so far. Again, interference mitigation may be achieved through at the primary time. It means they're operational at different times, but there is also possibility of frequency, power, geography. All those other three levers can also be used towards interference mitigation. And in most cases, the new entrance is expected to live with some interference resulting in certain degree of, and perhaps resulting in certain degree of performance degradation, or even lack of reliability. Right? So, for example, if in the CBRS band, if there is activation of the naval radars in a particular frequency, and the commercial base station was using that frequency, whether it can move to another frequency or not depends upon what is available. It may be able to move to another frequency that is not shared, but there is obviously going to be some degree of quality of service degradation that the system will have to be willing to take, just to be able to take advantage of the spectrum whenever it is available. Now, also again, it's worth repeating that there are different radars, as we talked about, and they have different operating characteristics. So we will need different approaches to meet the requirements of the performance, and there's again no single solution that we should be thinking of that can take care of all the situations. Next slide, please. So this is a bird's eye view of what we discussed before, but hopefully it will give things in an overall high-level perspective. We talked about multi-user spectrum access. On one hand, we talked about coexistence, and then we talked about sharing. For coexistence, we said once the operating conditions are established, they do not change over time. Like, for example, the AMBIT CPA, once we agree that these are the base stations that can operate and these are the conditions under which they can operate, they do not change over the life of the use of the new entrant. They do not change. They're very much static. Then we talk about sharing, but it's a semi-static. Once the operating conditions looking for the new entrants are established, they may not change in 24 hours. Say, for example, as we talked about the US 6 gigahertz, they are not checked for another 24 hours. After that, they may have to change depending upon if some new licensed operators came on board or not. They may have to, but at least for semi-static, because for the 24 hours, they don't have to change anything. Then you're talking about dynamic. Again, the difference between dynamic and high dynamic is something we are using within our forum just to differentiate ourselves from the CBRS world. This is not cast in concrete, but we need to keep the difference in mind so that we understand the challenges we have. So in the dynamic environment, we need to detect or be notified of the incumbent and decide on a course of action and execute to reduce interference in a matter of, let's say, 5 minutes, as in CBRS, as we have seen. But as we go to the 3.1 to 3.45, and we saw the mobility aspects, the main difference fundamentally, at least one of the main differences is going to be in the time scale. You not only have to detect the operation and execute to reduce interference in a few seconds, and could be even less, but we do not know at this moment what the requirements are. But the requirements are going to be significantly tighter than what we have in CBRS, and this is why a completely new approach, a new perspective needs to be taken on, and that's why really we started this whole effort in Wireless Innovation Forum to look into the possible solutions and come up with perspectives or architectural views about how this highly dynamic spectrum sharing can be achieved. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to look a little bit more carefully how this highly dynamic spectrum arrangement differs from the traditional, say, 3 gigahertz or the CBRS kind of environment that is happening. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the differences in approaches between low 3 gigahertz compared to the CBRS spectrum? Let's again have a quick review. Many of these should be quite intuitive, but sometimes it helps to look at them side by side. The CBRS, the radars are mostly coastal and some inland, only one airborne radar cover area, as Andy mentioned. As opposed to the lower 3 gigahertz, radars are located all over the country and they can be fixed, mobile, or airborne. Immediately, it becomes obvious the degree of challenges that are different in the two bands. Right? Here, there are limited number of radars with a handful of operating characteristics. Most are naval radars or fixed. But in the lower 3 gigahertz, we have several dozens of radars with different operating characteristics. I mean, some of them are rotating, some of them are fixed, some of them are mobile, some of them are stationary, some of them have the shorter pulses, some of the longer pulses, many different operating characteristics. They come, I mean, different amounts of bandwidth they use. The type of operating characteristics, very large number of characteristics we deal with in lower 3 gigahertz. In CBRS, most radars are stationary, relatively slow moving, and lower 3 gigahertz they can be stationary, relatively slow moving, or very fast moving. Here is another interesting one to watch out for. In CBRS, the radars are mostly at the ground level, impacting base stations that are relatively closer. But in lower 3 gigahertz, there are airborne radars at high altitudes. Thus, the visibility of the radar from base stations can be from much farther away. So the impacted number of base stations could be, or impacting vast number of base stations could be significantly larger compared to the CBRS radars. Interference mitigation techniques may be applied and remove relatively slowly as the naval radars move relatively slowly. But here, our interference mitigation techniques have to be very fast, again, because of the speed of the mobility and to make sure that the radars do perform at the rate that they are supposed to do. Here, we talked about the CBRS, we talked about ESC sensors and portals. Lower 3 gigahertz, we do not know what the mechanism is going to be, but it is an opportunity for us. Andy mentioned some of the drawbacks of the ESC sensors, and here we will have an opportunity to overcome shortcomings of the ESC sensors and improve portal-based notification. So we look at this entire venture on highly dynamic spectrum here as an opportunity to improve upon what the existing system is. Next slide, please.
Hey, Amit, before you go on, there's a question posted. You mentioned that highly dynamic in this context is a few seconds. Do you have something that you can reference that indicates that few seconds, or is that just a best guess based on understanding the incumbent?
Sure. So in the demo discussions that we have had with some folks from NTIA, their guideline is for the first demo, they want to see the base station system respond in 10 seconds or less. So that's, again, it's anecdotal, but this is the order of magnitude that they're talking about. And my guess is, as you go into real life implementation, that is going to be stricter and stricter as we go on. But for starting point, that's what they indicated to us. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so now a look at the potential system. And again, the physical implementation will be different, but conceptually, we're thinking about say 3 functional entities and looking at a longer term implementation. What are the 3 main entities that need to be key players in this act of sharing? Of course, there is a lot of onus on the new commercial user. There is some sort of a spectrum manager, and I'm just generically calling it spectrum manager, whether it is some evolution of SAS or something that coming out of a REC or some management system. We leave that aside. That will come in actual implementation. Leave that as a functional entity. And then we also see the incumbent user also has, incumbent federal user also has a role to play. Let's look at quickly, what do these things mean? The commercial user has to manage its transmission, right? So it has to minimize interference towards the incumbent by using different techniques, including nulling, beam muting, EIRP monitoring, and even layer management. When there is no other alternative, they move the subscribers to a different band, spectrum band altogether. There are different ways of managing the traffic on that particular channel. And on the receive side, they have to perform, accept some level of interference from the incumbent, and they'll still have to optimize performance in spite of constraint. And there may be some also option, or at least you'll see some motivation for finding harmful interference, detecting harmful interference and reporting it. So there could be some sort of a back and forth. And I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit later on. Then if we talk about the spectrum manager, which is a lot of this, the coordination function is done through the spectrum manager. It receives information about all the users, both incumbent and new entrant, about location, use time, etc. Stores the system operating characteristics and production criteria so that it can determine, perform the interference estimates, and decide on spectrum allocation, including frequency, time, geography, etc. And it can possibly also arbitrate harmful interference, saying that this is what has been agreed upon. So you guys figure out how to, even if you are receiving interference, figure out how to work with the level of interference, because this is already agreed upon. Last but not the least, even the federal incumbent user should have a role to play, at least going forward, even if it is not in short term, in a longer term, because at the end of the day, sharing has to be a two-way street. It cannot be just the new and commercial user has to do everything on the spectrum manager, and the incumbent federal user should not be doing anything. That's not sharing. So it has to accept some predetermined level of interference and still maintain performance. And it should be able to detect any harmful interference that is above the level that have been agreed upon. And it should also be able to manage some of its harmful radiation in the longer term, if there is again arrangement that the new commercial user should not receive something beyond it. It should be able to manage that as well. And in a way, it is actually important even for the federal users to develop these capabilities, because in the within the country, yes, they can potentially get a very, very protected environment, but when operating in actual battlefield scenarios, they will have to live with different levels of interference. And our perception is developing this capability will also improve their battlefield readiness. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, now we're talking about very high level implementation schemes for sensing purposes, or identifying and knowing that the radar is active. There are two main types of systems that we're talking about, and these are not mutually exclusive. They can be used in conjunction with each other. One is a sensor-based system, something like ESC, but hopefully better in many ways. As Andy mentioned before, the sensor-based, the ESC has had a lot of constraints or drawbacks. And then it could be a notification-based system. In the sensor, among the sensor-based system, there are two types that are being discussed, considered for now. Independent sensors like the ESCs, but also there is another alternative that is being discussed, is using the RAN, the radio itself, as a sensor. So part of the radio resources could be dedicated towards sensors. This avoids the need for having a separate sensor network. Both have their pros and cons, but we're not going to get into detail. But overall, sensor-based system, the beauty of this thing is there is no manual effort in terms of notifying the base stations or the commercial system that they're becoming active and so on and so forth. So it's very much automated system. There's no manual intervention needed. The con side is that there could be error possibility, and error could be both positive or negative, meaning the sensor could be detecting some radar activity when actually there is none, and taking off the commercial system when there is no need. Also, it could be missing radar system. So all those possible glitches have to be worked out with thorough testing and so on and so forth. The other possibility, again, these are non-exclusive, they could be existing in conjunction with it, is a notification-based system. And this notification-based system could be a DoD managed system like the TARDIS 3, for example, that you have in CBRS, or it could be a fully commercially managed system externally. Whether it satisfies DoD's purpose of mission security or not, those have to be identified. But there are obviously benefits of having a commercial system as well. The main advantage here is the responsibility for notification goes towards the incumbent. So there is no burden on part of the commercial system to identify. It is always the responsibility of the federal system to notify when it is becoming active. So so there's the less error prone from that perspective. But the flip side of that is it could be that the notification could provide overprotecting, means they will be overly predicting what their own needs are in terms of how long they will be operating, when they might be operating, and thus they may be over occupying the system. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a quick view of the two different systems and what kind of requirement they put on the overall spectrum management system. So there are, I'm giving you the example in the context of a sensor-based system, and we'll have a similar example for notification-based system. So if we think about the incumbent, right? The incumbent, it becomes at an instant as a T sub S becomes active, and T sub R is the instant when the incumbent experiences the relief from the commercial interference. And TIR is the time interval, capital TIR is the time interval between the two. So there would be some sort of a requirement that once I become active, this is from the incumbent perspective, I must get relief within this time interval, right? Otherwise, my performance is at risk. This is from the incumbent perspective. Now, how does that translate to the commercial system? Again, this is a sensor-based system. So TA, let's say, is the instant when the commercial system senses incumbent activity, and the TP instant when the sensing system positively detects incumbent activity. Just because it senses something does not mean that it is assumed it has to positively identify this. So there is some sort of a time gap between T sub A and T sub P. And so TAP is the time for positive detection. And then there is a T sub C when the interval, the course of action, the spectrum management system will decide, well, now I have detected that this particular system is being active. What do I need to do? Which are the base stations that I need to inform? And it takes some time to do those calculations. And finally, TM is the time interval to implement the interference mitigation, whether it's beam muting, channel shifting, etc., etc. So it takes the TM. If you say TIM is the interval, total interval that the incumbent system needs to sense the activation all the way to implementation of a mitigation means. So from a requirement perspective, as you can see, this implementation time should be less than what is required from incumbent system perspective. So we come up with this high level requirement. The implementation time has to be less than equal to the requirement from the system, the system. This is one example. Next slide, please. This is, very similar, so I'm going to go quickly on this thing. This is from a notification system. Again, there is a time interval when the notification goes, and the TR when the instant when the incumbent experiences the relief from the commercial event. So TIR again is the requirement for implementation, right? Otherwise, the incumbent's system performance will be degraded. From the commercial system perspective, the instant when the incumbent sends out the notification, but then it receives at a certain point in TG who is delivered, and then it takes action over time C, and then it implements very similar to what it had before. And again, in similar spirit, the implementation time here, even with the notification system, has to be less than or equal to the required interval that the incumbent needs to maintain its mission or complete mission without service degradation. It's a very similar, but there are subtle differences, and in implementation, we need to keep those things in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is let's say enhancement to what we have discussed so far and what has been implemented anywhere that you know of. All that we have seen so far is what we call an open loop system, right? So let's say the sensor or the notification system tells the spectrum management system that the radar has become active, so you manage the interference toward the radar, and the spectrum management system takes some actions. But there is no real measurement back and forth between the radars and the commercial systems about how effective those methods are, whether they are overly restrictive or not, and so on and so forth. So what happens in these open case systems, most of the time, we are overprotective of the radar system. And as Andy mentioned, that in the revised calculations, there are much relaxed measurements of path loss calculations with clutter and so on and so forth. So the size of the DPA never got reduced. If we can have similar kind of thoughts right in the beginning, there is some sort of a sensor notification system. There's a back and forth between the radar and the commercial system. We can actually have perhaps a much more robust system and less conservative that can allow better sharing of the system. So again, from a conceptual perspective, if we think of, let's say the federal system initiates or starts operating, the notification and sensing system gets updated, and the non-federal system adjusts its parameters to avoid interference towards the radar. And then there's a check. Is the federal system okay? If it is yes, the non-federal system continues operation. But if it is not enough, whatever mitigation techniques the non-federal system has operated, it will adjust its parameters again, and it might go on a few times before the federal system says, well, I can discriminate my radar objects, I'm working fine, and the federal system, non-federal system continues operation. But remember, one very important aspect of spectrum sharing is not only to give relief to the federal system, but also whenever the federal system is not active, the non-federal system should be able to use the spectrum. Otherwise, there will be inefficient use of the spectrum. So the non-federal system will check from time to time, is federal system still active? If it is, then of course it continues its operation. If not, it can quickly resume its normal operation. So this closed loop system will help not only in determining what is the minimum restriction with which the commercial systems can operate, but also it should allow it to go back to normal operations as soon as the federal system goes off air. So this resumption is just as important, at least from a system design perspective, we should keep in mind in order to make most efficient use of the system. I think that's pretty much from my side. Lee, I think it is next part is yours.
Yeah, so we're at time. So I think what I'm going to do is kind of skip the next section, other than to say the Wireless Innovation Forum has formed a highly dynamic spectrum sharing work group. This group is chaired by Andy and Amit. And we're really looking for input from all stakeholders who are interested in the lower 3 gigahertz band for our initial report. We included in the slides what the outline of what we're actually looking at. And the key point is we're hoping to send our initial technical report to ballot next month. So we've got about a month that folks, if they want to get involved, can join and participate and provide contributions against that outline. Folks who are already Win Forum members, can just go ahead and join the group. If you're not a Win Forum member and you're interested in participating, we'd be delighted to have you join. Please contact me and I will give you more information. Again, here's the topics that we're going to be looking at in the report, and I'll just leave it there because I don't want to use up too much of everybody's time. We've already lost quite a few people off the webinar because we're a bit over. So with that, I'll let Andy or Amit, if you guys have any last comments that you want to make before we close. Otherwise, I invite you all to contact us directly or visit wirelessinnovation.org for more information. Andy, Amit, any closing thoughts?
The only thought, Lee, is that, for the questions we didn't get to during my portion or whatever, just email me directly. I'll be glad to answer. And just, if you have other questions, please give me a shout.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Amit, any last thoughts?
No, just reach out to us and contribute in the development of the new technological advances.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Andy and Amit, for making your presentations today. They're really appreciated, and we look forward to talking to everybody more in the future. Thanks, and we'll close now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.